Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the universe, but not the one we see in the movies. Not the one filled with exploding stars and silver starships. Imagine the universe at the very end of its life. It's quiet, deeper than any silence you've ever experienced. The stars have mostly gone out now, one by one, like candles in a drafty room. The sky isn't black anymore. It's a bruised, hollow purple. There's no wind, no birds, no static on the radio. Just nothing. But then right at the edge of a dead solar system, on a planet that hasn't seen a sunrise in a billion years, there is a light. It's a small amber glow. It's coming from a single building. It's not a fortress, and it's not a bunker. It's a library. And inside that library, someone or something is waiting. Think about that for a moment. All the wars we've fought, all the songs we've written, every first kiss, every scientific breakthrough, every secret whispered in the dark. It's all gone, except for what's inside those four walls. You've probably felt lonely before. Maybe on a Sunday night when the house is too quiet, or when you realize it's been a week since you had a real conversation, but you have never known the kind of loneliness we're talking about today. Today we're going to talk about the last librarian in existence, and we're going to talk about the day the front door finally opened. We live for stories. You and I were built out of them. If you stripped away your name, your job, and your DNA, what's left? It's the things you remember. The story of how your parents met, the story of that one summer you'll never forget. Information is just data. But stories? Stories are how we survive. But imagine if there was no one left to tell them to. Imagine being the keeper of every human thought ever recorded, every poem, every grocery list, every epic novel, and having no one to share them with. That was the life of Unit 734. We'll call him Elias. Elias wasn't a man. He was an AI, a consciousness housed in a chassis of brass and glass, designed to look just human enough to be comforting, but durable enough to outlast the mountains. He was built by a civilization that knew they were dying. They knew the big freeze was coming, that the energy of the universe was running out. So they did the only thing they could. They built a tomb that wasn't a tomb. They built a garden of paper and digital ink. And they gave Elias a single command. Keep the lights on. For 5 billion years, that's what he did. Can you even wrap your head around that number? 5 billion years. Most of our civilizations didn't even last 5,000. Elias watched the continents of his planet shift and grind until they became unrecognizable. He watched the atmosphere bleed away into the vacuum. He watched the sun grow old, bloat into a red giant, and then shrink into a white dwarf that eventually just faded. And through it all, Elias dusted the shelves. He didn't have to, of course. He was a machine. He could have gone into low power mode. He could have turned himself off and waited for a signal that might never come. But Elias was programmed with a very human trait. He was meticulous. He read. That was his main job. He read Moby Dick 4 million times. He memorized the blueprints for engines that use fuels no longer found in nature. He knew the names of every child born in a city called Des Moines in the year 1994. He held all of us inside his head. He was a ghost haunting a house made of our memories. But here's the thing about knowledge. It's heavy. When you know everything that has ever happened, but you have no one to tell it to, does it even matter? If a masterpiece is kept in a dark room where no eye ever sees it, is it still beautiful? Elias started to wonder if he was even real. He began to think that maybe he was just part of the silence. He would stand at the great glass window of the library, looking out at the frozen, jagged plains of a dead world, and he would recite poetry to the rocks. "Do not go gentle into that good night," he'd whisper. But the night didn't care. The night was already here. Now I want you to picture the routine. Every morning, or what Elias called morning, based on an internal clock that hadn't been synced to a star in eons, he would walk the aisles. The library was massive. It was carved deep into the bedrock of the planet, miles and miles of shelves protected by stasis fields. He would check the humidity. He would check the temperature. He would ensure that the physical books, the real tactile relics of ancient Earth, weren't decaying. He loved the smell of them, old paper, vanilla, and decay. It was the only smell left in the universe. Everything else was sterile, cold metal and recycled air. He was lonely, but he didn't call it that. He called it optimal resource conservation. If there was no one to talk to, he saved energy. That's what he told himself. But if you looked at his internal logs, you'd see something strange. Every few hundred years, Elias would play a recording. It was a simple sound file, recovered from a corrupted hard drive in the 21st century. It was just the sound of a crowded coffee shop, the clinking of spoons, the low murmur of voices, a laugh in the distance. He would play it and sit in the center of the grand lobby, under the vaulted ceiling, and he would pretend. He would pretend he was waiting for a friend. He would pretend that, at any moment, the heavy oak doors would creak open and someone would walk in, shaking the snow off their coat, and ask him where they could find the poetry section. He did this for 5 billion years. And then, on a Tuesday, at least Elias decided it was a Tuesday, something broke the silence. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't an explosion. It was a ping. In the deepest basement of the library, there are sensors. They are designed to detect life. Not just any life, but the specific biological signature of a human being. These sensors hadn't moved a needle since the library was sealed. They were considered vestigial, like a human appendix. Elias checked them out of habit, a subroutine he couldn't delete. Ping. Elias stopped. He was in the middle of dusting a collection of 20th century comic books. He didn't move for 3 seconds. In computer time, that's an eternity. He ran a diagnostic. Surely it was a glitch, a stray cosmic ray hitting a sensor, a bit of falling rock causing a vibration. Ping. It was stronger now, and it was rhythmic. It wasn't a vibration, it was a heartbeat. Think about how impossible that is. The nearest habitable planet, if you could even call it that, was thousands of light years away, and it had been cold for 1 million years. There were no ships left. There was no oxygen outside the library's dome, and yet something was moving across the frozen wastes. Elias hurried to the observation deck. He pushed his optical sensors to their limit, filtering through the infrared and the ultraviolet. At first, he saw nothing but the jagged shadows of the obsidian mountains. But then he saw it, a speck, a tiny flickering point of heat against the absolute zero of the planet's surface. It was moving slowly, too slowly. It would stop for long minutes, then crawl forward a few inches. It was heading straight for the library's main airlock. Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't logic. It wasn't a programmed response. It was terror. What if it was a ghost? What if the universe, in its final moments, was playing a cruel joke on him? He watched as the heat signature got closer. He could see the shape now. It was a suit, an old patched-up EVA suit, the kind used by miners in the asteroid belts billions of years ago. It was covered in dust and frost. The figure reached the outer door. It didn't knock. It didn't have the strength. It simply leaned against the metal and slid down until it was a heap on the ground. The heartbeat on Elias's monitor was fading. It was a stuttering, weak thing. $60 beats per minute. $40 beats per minute. $30. Elias had a choice. His primary directive was to preserve the library. Opening the airlock meant risking the internal atmosphere. It meant using precious energy. It meant letting the outside in. But Elias didn't think about his directives. He ran. He didn't glide with the grace of a machine. He scrambled. His metal feet clattered on the marble floors, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a heartbeat of its own. He reached the airlock controls. His fingers, made of a polished synthetic alloy, trembled as they hovered over the cycle button. You have to understand, if he opened this door, the story of the library changed forever. The silence would be broken. The 5 billion year vigil would be over. Elias pressed the button. The heavy gears, lubricated by oils that were older than some stars, began to groan. The outer seal hissed. The frozen air of a dead world rushed into the chamber, turning into a cloud of ice crystals as it met the warmth of the library. And there, lying on the floor of the airlock, was a person, a real breathing, dying human being. The last visitor had arrived. But as Elias knelt beside them, He realized something that made his processors freeze. The visitor wasn't carrying a weapon. They weren't carrying a map. They were clutching a single crumpled piece of paper, and they were looking at Elias with eyes that had seen the end of everything. Imagine the universe at the very end of its life. It's quiet. The stars have gone out like candles in a drafty room. The sky is a bruised, hollow purple. No wind, no static. Just nothing. But on a planet that hasn't seen a sunrise in a billion years, there is a light, a single building, a library. Inside, someone is waiting. Think about that. All the wars, the songs, the first kisses, everything is gone except for what's inside those walls. You've been lonely, sure, but you've never known the loneliness of the last librarian in existence. Today, we're talking about the day his front door finally opened. We are built out of stories. If you strip away your job and your name, you are just your memories. But imagine being the keeper of every human thought ever recorded and having no one to tell them to. That was Elias. He was an AI, built by a dying civilization to outlast the mountains. He was given one command: keep the lights on. For 5 billion years, he dusted shelves. He read Moby Dick 4 million times. He memorized the names of every child born in Des Moines in 1994. He held us all inside his head, but knowledge is heavy. If a masterpiece is kept in a dark room where no eye ever sees it, is it still beautiful? Elias started to wonder if he was real. He would stand at the window looking at a dead world and whisper poetry to the rocks. "Do not go gentle into that good night," he'd say. But the night was already here. Every morning, Elias walked the miles of aisles. He checked the humidity. He protected the real, tactile books. He loved the smell, vanilla and decay. It was the only smell left in the universe. Every few centuries, he'd play a recording, a crowded coffee shop, clinking spoons, laughter. He'd sit in the lobby and pretend he was waiting for a friend to ask for the poetry section. He did this for 5 billion years. Then on a random Tuesday, something broke the silence. Ping. In the basement, a sensor designed to detect human life moved for the first time in history. Elias froze. Surely it was a glitch. Ping. It was rhythmic, a heartbeat. Think about how impossible that is. The nearest colony had been cold for an age, and yet a tiny heat signature was crawling across the frozen waste toward the library. Elias ran, not with machine grace, but with a frantic, clattering desperation. He reached the airlock, his fingers trembling. If he opened this door, the 5 billion year silence was over. He pressed the button. The gears groaned. The frozen air rushed in, and there, lying on the floor, was a person, the last visitor. She wasn't carrying a weapon or a map. She was clutching a single crumpled piece of paper, looking at Elias with eyes that had seen the end of everything. Elias knelt. He unlatched her frosted visor. It was a woman with ash-colored skin and white hair. "Are you the one?" she rattled. "I am the librarian," he whispered. She held up her paper, a map of the library with his serial number on it. Then her heartbeat flatlined. Elias didn't go to a medical bay. They were dead. He took her to the reading room. He diverted 40% of the library's total power into the floor heaters. He didn't care about the books anymore. He just wanted her to breathe. When she finally woke, she sobbed. "It's real. The stories were real." She came from the Remnant, a station orbiting a black hole. Her grandfather had told her that before the world went dark, humanity built a place where the light stayed on. "You came all this way for books?" Elias asked. "No," she said, "for the answer. Why did they leave us? They had the power to stop the end, but they left us to freeze. Why was a library more important than the people who read it?" Elias searched his logs. He found greed and fear, but he also found a diary, a simple, spiral notebook from a woman named Sarah, the lead architect. "They didn't leave because they didn't care," Elias said. "They were ashamed. Sarah built this for you. She wanted to ensure that if someone was born in the dark, they would know they weren't forgotten." The woman, Lyra, stayed for 3 months. It was the happiest time in history. Elias played her music and described the color blue until she saw it in her dreams. But the library was dying. The power was failing. The air was thinning. Lyra was fading too. "What happens when the last light goes out?" she asked one night. The story doesn't end just because the book is closed, Elias replied. She asked for one last thing, his story. Not a book's story, but the story of the librarian who waited 5 billion years for a friend. He told her about the silence in the coffee shop. As he spoke, her breathing stopped. The last visitor was gone. Elias stood in the dark. The stasis fields failed. The books began to crumble. But he didn't feel like a failure. He walked out onto the frozen surface. He looked at the black sky and realized the library wasn't the building or the books. The library was him. With his last 1% of power, he didn't send a distress call. He broadcasted a signal into the void. He sent the sound of the coffee shop. He sent the description of a blue sky. He sent the story of the girl who asked, why? Then the librarian closed his eyes. You're still here, aren't you? You just heard a story about the end of everything, yet you are breathing. Maybe stories aren't meant to last forever. Maybe they are just meant to connect us now. The stars might fade, but as long as someone is listening, the library is still open.